Hey friend, I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin this strange and quiet journey through the darkest corners of medieval life, do me a small favor, take just a second and hit the like button if you enjoy stories like this. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that too. It helps more than you know. Now, just out of curiosity, where in the world are you watching from right now? And what time is it for you? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Let me know down in the comments. I love seeing how far and wide this sleepy little corner of the internet has stretched. Okay, tonight's story is not about kings or castles, nor noble quests or gallant swordsmen. It's not about courtly romance or poetic knights. No. Tonight, we turn our eyes away from the painted ceilings and golden thrones, and instead descend into the shadows. We'll walk the unlit alleys behind butcher stalls and step barefoot into the damp corners of medieval Europe, where filth clung to every wall and hope curled up beside despair. This is not the Middle Ages you read about in fairy tales. This is the side you were never meant to see. These are the jobs, the lives people were born into, doomed to serve in, and often disappeared inside of. The profession so vile, so revolting, so spiritually and physically corrosive, that they were spoken about only in whispers, if spoken about at all, and yet someone had to do them. Not every peasant was a farmer. Not every townsman was a cobbler. Some were executioners. Others were leech collectors. Some dug graves by hand until their fingers bled, while others cleaned the filth from castle latrines for a crust of bread. And tonight, we will walk beside them, slowly, carefully, listening to what the silence of their work left behind. The first profession we visit belongs to the man with no name, not because he wished to be forgotten, but because society refused to know him. He was the night soil collector. His job was not just unpleasant, it was unspeakable. In towns with no plumbing, where sewage ran freely beneath slatted walkways and chamber pots were emptied from windows without warning, he was the one who stepped into the mire. Long after the city fell asleep and the church bells had gone silent, he would rise from whatever hovel he slept in, sling a thick leather bucket across his shoulders, and walk the streets barefoot. His skin was always slick with sweat and something worse. The stench followed him like a second shadow. Children were told that if they didn't behave, he would come and take them, not because he was cruel, but because he was invisible, forgotten. And the things he touched were cursed by their own necessity. His pay was barely enough to live, but he worked, every night, climbing beneath the city to collect what no one dared acknowledge. The rats didn't fear him. The worms gave him space. And when he passed, the dogs whined low, unsure if he was still one of them. And sometimes, neither was he. They say his eyes became pale over time, not from blindness, but from seeing too clearly in the dark. Our second profession, if it can even be called, that lived above, not below. The sign eater. You might think of priests or clerics when you hear that, but the sign eater was neither holy nor blessed. He was the spiritual refuse of the village. When someone died, especially someone wealthy, who had much to confess but not enough time to do it, the family would call for him. He would arrive not through the front door, but through the back, often in ragged clothes, often with eyes downcast. A piece of bread would be placed upon the chest of the corpse, a mug of ale beside the bed. He would sit. Alone, he would eat, slowly, in silence. The bread, they believed, absorbed the sins of the dead. By consuming it, the sign eater took on their guilt, their crimes, their secrets. The family would never thank him. They would never look him in the eye. He was paid in coin no one else would accept. And when he walked through the village, even the children stepped away, because no one knew what he had eaten last. But everyone feared it. These were real people, real lives. Real hands that toiled and bled and rotted in service of a society that needed them but could not bear to name them. In the next hours, we will follow more of them, through mud and mire, through blood and bone. We will learn about the executioner who sharpened his axe by candlelight, but was forbidden from eating with other men. The plague barriers who sang to themselves to drown out the sounds in the pit. The dog killers, the leech sellers, the finger pullers. Each of them real. Each of them remembered by no one, except us, tonight. So take a breath, settle in, and let the dark corner of medieval history unfold slowly, one shadowed life at a time. The road winds deeper now, narrowing with every step, as though it knows what we're approaching and wants to keep it hidden. There is no lantern here, no torchlight on stone walls. Only the sound of your own footsteps, muffled by the thick coat of filth coating the ground, and the slow, rhythmic creak of wooden wheels being dragged through the mud somewhere far ahead. You feel watched, not by people, but by the memory of those who once walked this path and never turned back. The next profession waits in silence, behind the low wooden gate of a cottage that has no chimney smoke, no sound of life within. It is the home of the plague barrier. You would not know him by his face, for it is always covered masked, not from fear of disease, but from the unbearable weight of recognition. His hands are wrapped in old linens soaked in vinegar and prayer. He carries no tools, save for a length of rope and a stick to poke the corpses, to ensure they no longer twitch. No one thanks him. No one speaks to him. When the pestilence came, knocking down door after door, this man was the one who went in. He would step over collapsed fathers, lift fever-wasted children into carts, and drag them, one by one, to the pit dug just outside the edge of the city. The grave was never deep enough. There were always more bodies than earth. He didn't dig for dignity. He dug for containment. His boots were stained to the knees, his breath shallow, his voice lost. They say that sometimes he would hum under his breath as he worked, not from madness, but to drown out the final cries of those still half alive. He couldn't wait. He couldn't risk it. The job was to empty the houses, and that meant everyone, even if they begged, even if they blinked. If they were inside, they went into the ground. His sleep was never silent. His dreams always smelled of rot. The next man lived near the execution field. He was not the headsman, though he envied his clarity. No, this was the flesh boiler, a job so gruesome and specific it was almost never spoken of aloud. When nobles were executed, and their bones were to be preserved in sanctified soil or displayed as warnings, the flesh had to be removed. But it could not be burned too dishonorable, and so it was boiled. A giant black cauldron, bubbling night and day with water thickened by blood and sinew. The headsman's blade ended the life, but this man ended the face. He would strip the bodies, sometimes still warm, place them into the water, and wait. The smell was unbearable. No mixture of herbs could hide it. It clung to his skin, to his home, even to his thoughts. His family left years ago. He told people it was the plague. But the truth was, they simply could no longer bear the taste of the air around him. His neighbors moved away. He stopped being invited to church. The priest averted his eyes. But someone had to do it. The bones had to be clean. The crowd expected it. He worked without complaint, without reward. Some say that when he died, no one claimed the body, and it was his own cauldron that finally swallowed him. Then there were the animal men, the collectors of strays, not for kindness, not for shelter, but for slaughter. In every town, the dog killer walked with a bag of rusted hooks and a club wrapped in leather. Dogs were pests, they said, filthy, diseased, dangerous. And so they were caught and beaten, sometimes in broad daylight, sometimes in front of the children who had named them. The dog killer didn't care. He was numb. Long ago, when he was just a boy, he'd begged for a coin from the guild. They had none to give, but they offered him a job. He accepted. And with each scream and whimper, something inside him closed. Now he walked without blinking, without mercy. They say his hands twitched at night. Not from guilt, but from habit, as if still reaching for something soft to break. And when his shift ended, he would sit alone behind the tannery, feeding the rats with scraps of meat too foul for even the pit. The smell of his work lingered in the air long after he was gone, and even the wind refused to carry it away. But perhaps no profession was more feared than the torturer, not the executioner. He ended things. The torturer extended them, made hours feel like eternities, made pain feel like art. The torturer's workshop was beneath the courthouse, a stone room with no windows, only slits for ventilation. The walls were lined with racks, wheels, hooks, braziers, and chairs with spikes no one sat in willingly. But the most terrifying part wasn't the devices, it was the silence. The torturer didn't scream. He didn't speak, he only worked. Carefully, precisely, his hands were clean, his eyes dispassionate. He did not hate his victims. He simply believed in the process. He did not care for guilt or innocence, only confession. And when the screams grew too loud, he would whisper in their ear. A single word, over and over, soon. No one saw his face, not because it was hidden, but because it was forgettable. You could pass him in the market, on the steps of the chapel, and never know what his hands had done that morning, or what they were about to do tonight. He died with a full purse, but an empty name. And the stone slab where he once worked is still cold, no matter how warm the season. There are more, so many more. Lives spent in darkness, in shame, in service to a world that never looked back. But tonight, we walk with them, step by step, into the next chamber of horror, into the next memory no one asked for but someone had to carry. And now, that someone is us. The road narrows again, not because the village ends, but because memory does. These are not jobs you can write into ledgers or teach apprentices to perform. These are not trades that pass from father to son. These are stains, deep, oily impressions left in the corners of towns that refuse to name them. And yet, they existed, not as myths, but as men and women who did what others would not. The next one is a woman. Her hands are calloused, not from labor, but from grip. She is the wailer for hire, in a time when public mourning was both custom and spectacle. Grieving families, especially those who lacked children or relatives, would pay someone to cry. Not a quiet cry, not a whisper of tears, but a full, body-racking, soul-tearing wail. She would arrive dressed in black, with veil and rosary, but her eyes were always dry before she began. And when she did begin, the village stopped. It was a sound so raw, so old, it felt like it came from the earth itself. She screamed the name of the dead, invented sins for them to be forgiven for, cursed them and forgave them in the same breath. Her performance could last for hours. Sometimes she collapsed from it. Sometimes she was carried away. And when it ended, she was paid in bread and a silence too wide to cross. People feared her not because she lied, but because her cries were more real than the ones they could summon for their own blood. And when she wept for your father, your brother, your child, it was not just grief she carried, it was ownership. She cried better than you could, and that made you hate her. The next profession was not always paid. Sometimes it was assigned, by force, by fear, by threat of death. The body thief, not a grave robber. Those wanted jewels, trinkets, gold teeth. The body thief wanted flesh, skin, bones, specimens. In the growing halls of medieval medicine, when church law forbade dissection, the body thief was summoned in secret. They would wait until the watchman slept, creep into fresh graves and dig quickly, quietly. Not for the dead, but for what they contained. Some corpses were still warm. Some hadn't yet stiffened. They would be transported under blankets, in hay carts, in beer barrels, and brought to candlelit cellars, where robed men with knives whispered prayers they did not believe. The thief was not thanked, was not even seen, only paid, handed coins by gloved hands that never made eye contact. The thief would leave before sunrise, sometimes with a little less of their own soul, sometimes with none. The physicians got wiser. They asked for fresher, younger, cleaner. And the thief got bolder. The line between the dead and the nearly dead blurred. And when one subject gasped in the dissecting chair, no one asked how they got there. They simply began. Another profession hides in plain sight: the charcoal burner. A simple man, you might think. He cuts wood. He burns it. He sells the coal. But it's not that simple. The burner lives far from the town, alone, in a hut so covered in soot that the walls cry black tears when it rains. He works day and night beside giant smoldering mounds of earth that hide the fires beneath. He watches them like children, feeding them, turning them, listening to their needs. One wrong breath, and the whole pile collapses, suffocating him in burning dirt. The smoke from his camp curls over the hills like a warning. His skin is cracked, his eyes always red, he speaks little, eats less. And when he comes to town with bags of coal on his back, the villagers step aside. Not from respect, but from fear. His silence is too thick, his presence too still. It's said that if you stand beside his fire at night, you hear voices in the smoke. Not his, the trees, the ones he burned. And if you listen too long, you forget your own. Some say the charcoal burner was never born, that he simply rose one day from the ashes, and that when he dies, his fire will simply find another body to wear. But even that would be mercy. Because he is alone, always. By trade, by curse. Another vile job was the leech gatherer. Not the seller, not the healer, the gatherer. She waded into marshes barefoot, slow, deliberate, letting the water ripple around her legs until the leeches found her. They always did. They latched on quickly, feeding as she stood motionless, humming to the reeds. Once they were full, she would peel them off gently, drop them into jars, and let them cling to the glass in lazy hunger. Her legs were scarred, always bleeding, always infected. But she didn't flinch. Not anymore. The villagers called her a witch. The children threw stones, but when their fathers fell ill or their mothers were fevered, it was her leeches the apothecary came for. And so she kept walking into the swamp, night after night, baiting herself with her own blood. She lived in a hut that stank of brine and old iron. She never lit candles, said they made the leeches nervous. She spoke to them like pets, named them, sang to them. And when she died, they say her body was found drained, not by violence, not by age, but by her own collection. One final harvest, one last gift. These were not criminals, not monsters, just people who were told what they were worth and accepted it. Because someone had to. Because the world was built on the backs of those no one ever sees. And as we leave this chapter, as the darkness grows deeper and the fire fades lower, we carry them with us. Their names are forgotten, but their work still echoes. In the silence, in the shadows, in the things we never ask how they are done. And now, we know. The next chapter begins where the fear goes quiet, and the horror becomes normal. Let's walk there together, slowly, always slowly. The quiet between chapters is deeper now, heavier, as though even the air is hesitant to move forward. But there is no going back. You've seen what most would turn away from, heard names never spoken aloud, yet the road continues, because history never ends in comfort. The second chapter leads us past the edge of memory and into places where horror was not hidden but normalized. The next profession wore a cloak not of shadow but of cloth, clean, well-tailored, embroidered with the crest of a noble house. He was the food taster, a man dressed like a lord, seated at tables of silver and spice, but never as a guest. His tongue, not his title, was his worth. Every morning, before the Duke broke his fast, the taster would be summoned. A servant would bring the wine, the fruit, the cured meats, the honey-smeared breads, and he would eat, slowly, deliberately. He was not permitted to show discomfort, even if the wine burned, even if the meat was off. If he gagged, the cook would lose a hand. If he wept, the kitchen would be flogged. He was not there to taste, he was there to survive. And if he didn't, then the poison had done its job. His name was known to the kitchen, to the stable boys, even to the bishop, but not to the lord. The master of the house never spoke to him, never looked at him. The taster was a shield, not a man. When he died, and they often did another, was hired the same day. No mourning, no candle lit. The next man wore his cloak, learned his allergies, and smiled when the sour cherry jam hit the tongue. They say the most skilled tasters developed immunity to many poisons. Their bodies became toxic themselves. But even they died young, not from poison, but from silence. From never being allowed to enjoy a single bite. Next, we find the bellman of the condemned. Not the town crier, not the church bell ringer, but the man who walked through the streets before a public execution, swinging a single iron bell and calling out the sins of the soon-to-be dead. He had no official training, only a voice worn from grief and a heart hardened by repetition. "Make way for justice," he would say, "make way for judgment." The villagers spat, some wept, others cheered, but none saw him. The bellman existed in a pocket of time between the crime and the drop. He was not executioner. He was not judge. He was a herald of endings. When the condemned were let out, he walked in front of them, never looking back. To look was to see fear, and he had seen enough. After the sentence was carried out, the bell was placed back on its hook, and he would return to his home at the edge of the cemetery. He lived alone, not because he wished it, but because the sound of his bell lingered. Dogs refused to approach. Children cried at the echo. And when he spoke, his voice always carried a little too far. Like the wind itself leaned closer to listen. Now we enter the butcher's alley. But not the butcher of animals. No, this was the barber surgeon. A man with knives as sharp as guilt and knowledge cobbled from rumor and trial. In an age when doctors were rare and priests warned against meddling with the body, the barber was both healer and harm. His red and white pole was not decoration, it was a symbol of blood and bandage, a warning, a promise. He would pull teeth with pliers once used to shape horseshoes. He would drain blood from the arms of fevered men using leeches or dull blades. He would lance boils, remove fingers, cut away rot. There was no anesthesia, only rope and courage. And when courage failed, screaming. He worked quickly, not because of skill, but because infection waited like a shadow. His tools were cleaned in wine, his hands rarely. He wore an apron stiff with dried blood, not his own, maybe not even human. Yet he saved lives. Sometimes. He also ended them. By mistake, by ignorance, by hope, and still people came. Because there was no one else. And because when you are drowning, you grab the blade offered to you. Even if it cuts, the next profession lives beneath the sanctuary. The ossuary keeper. You would not know him by sight, but by smell. The sweet, cloying scent of dust and old bone. His task was simple: arrange the remains of the faithful dead, but not in graves, in walls, in arches, in patterns so beautiful they made your stomach turn. He would stack femurs like firewood, skull atop skull, until a mural of grins stared back at the living. He knew each bone, could tell the age of the dead by the wear on their teeth, could distinguish man from woman by the curve of the pelvis, could identify disease from the texture of the marrow. He did not fear the dead, only the silence. For in the quiet of the ossuary, the bones whispered. Not words, not names, but memories, feelings, reminders. And when he finished, when the last tibia found its place beside the altar, he would kneel, place his forehead against the cold wall of the crypt, and say nothing, not out of reverence, but because he no longer trusted the sound of his own voice. These were not nightmares. These were livelihoods. These were not monsters. These were people who lived closer to death than most would ever dare. And they kept the world moving, kept the nobles fed, the towns clean, the church sacred. But no one carved their names in stone. No one sang songs for them, except maybe the wind, which tonight has grown quiet, as though listening, as though remembering. Let's continue. There are more waiting, more hands stained, more names lost. And we will find them, slowly, carefully, together. The path winds deeper now, no longer paved by memory but by the lingering impressions of forgotten hands. Each step echoes in a corridor of obscurity, lit only by the faint recollection of professions so vile, so necessary, they have been buried not just by time but by shame. We move slowly, because to hurry would be to miss the details, and in this part of the journey, details are all we have. The next figure we encounter does not live among the living, nor truly among the dead. She is the sign eater, not a metaphor, not a priest. A woman paid to consume the sins of the deceased. When a peasant or beggar died too poor to afford a proper funeral, the sign-eater was summoned. She arrived in silence, her eyes always lowered, her feet bare, her presence tolerated but never welcomed. She would sit at the head of the corpse, often a child or an old man, and a small loaf of bread and a mug of ale would be placed on the chest of the dead. As the family watched, if they watched at all, she would eat and drink in silence, never blessing the food, never thanking the giver. With each bite, it was said she absorbed the soul's burdens, its lies, betrayals, hatreds, lusts. She took them into herself, made the soul clean so it could pass through purgatory unhindered. And when the meal was done, she would leave without a word. No thanks, no eye contact, just a few coins wrapped in cloth and a reputation that made dogs growl when she walked by. No one would touch her. No one would sit near her in church. She ate too many souls, they said, too many secrets. And sometimes, when she passed a child, that child would scream not in fear, but in recognition, as if something inside them remembered what she had eaten. She grew thin over the years, not from lack of food, but from the weight of too many sins. Her hands trembled, her breath came ragged, but still she ate, because someone had to. The next figure is E, then more obscure. The corpse dresser. Not the undertaker, not the gravedigger, but the one who prepared the body not for burial, but for public display. In towns where executions were common and morality plays frequent, the corpse dresser ensured the dead looked the part. They stitched smiles onto broken faces, tied arms into poses of prayer, inserted glass into hollow eye sockets so the condemned might seem to stare forever into the crowd. They worked mostly at night, in lantern-lit chambers beneath the gallows or beside the church. No one spoke to them directly. Orders were left by door, instructions written hastily. Make the traitor weep. Let the child look peaceful. Sew the mouth shut. Their tools were simple needle, thread, wax, paint. Their art grotesque, yet precise. When crowds gathered to see the hanged man, they did not know they were looking at a sculpture, a mask made of real flesh, a lie told to soothe or terrify. And when the body rotted and the worms undid the stitchwork, the dresser was called again. Always again. Never thanked, only needed. And so they sewed, night after night, eyes red from smoke and vinegar, hands cramped from cold and sin. Sometimes they whispered apologies, sometimes they didn't. But they always returned. The next man is called the gong farmer. The name itself stinks. In cities and towns where sewage flowed not beneath, but into the streets, someone had to clean it. The gong farmer worked by night, descending into cesspits with nothing but a shovel, a rope, and the will to keep breathing. They scraped human waste from the bottom of latrines, emptied chamber pots, carried the filth out in buckets that steamed even in winter. They were paid well more than most tradesmen, but no one envied them. No one touched them. No one sat beside them. They lived on the outskirts, in houses the wind avoided. Their clothes could never be cleaned. Their skin carried the smell of other people's shame. They were spat on by the same men who paid them, beaten by drunks, mocked by children. And yet without them, the town died. Disease bloomed. Rats multiplied. Plague returned. The gong farmer was the wall between survival and collapse. And he knew it, but he never said it. He just kept digging, kept hauling, kept moving through darkness that no candle could penetrate. They say the best ones went deaf eventually. Not from noise, but from mercy. So they wouldn't hear what fell, wouldn't hear the rats, wouldn't hear themselves. Then there was the bone mill boy. A child, usually orphaned, often sold. His task was simple: grind bones into powder. Not for magic, not for war, for bread. In times of famine, when wheat failed and barley turned to dust, bones were boiled, dried, and milled to stretch the flour. It tasted like ash, smelled like rot, but it filled the belly. And someone had to grind. The boy worked beneath the millstone, turning a lever larger than himself, inhaling dust made from ribs and skulls. His lungs blackened, his eyes blurred. He was never taught to read. only to count 1 scoop, 2 scoops, 3 scoops, done. He didn't know the names of the dead he crushed, but sometimes he dreamed of them. Woke screaming with his hands clenched into fists he couldn't open. He never cried. There was no time. And when he coughed blood into his sleeve, the miller gave him stronger tea. And more bones. Always more bones. Each of these jobs was a wound carved into the body of the Middle Ages. And like all wounds, they were hidden beneath cloaks and silence. But they bled into everything, into bread, into death, into prayer. And now, as we walk further into this quiet, we carry the scent of it, the weight, the truth. There are more to find. Let's keep going, slowly, carefully, until even the darkest hands are known again. The road bends again, though by now it no longer feels like a path. It is more like a descent, one that happens so gradually you forget you are going down at all. You forget how light once felt, how silence once meant peace. Now it only echoes with breathless remembrance. We do not stop. We cannot. Because buried beneath history's clean pages are the lives scrubbed out with blood and soot, and their stories still linger, still whisper. The next profession was called the plague barrier. It was not an official title, not one worn with pride. It was given by the town after the first waves came and the bodies piled too quickly to bury. The barrier was a man, sometimes a boy, tasked with the simplest and most horrifying of duties, to live inside the quarantine zone, not to treat, not to bless, not to record, but to stay. He would be sent with enough food for 2 weeks, a sack of chalk for marking doors, and a wooden mallet. No weapon, no armor, only the burden of watching. When the sick cried out, he did not answer. When they begged, he marked their doors. When they died, he dragged their bodies into piles and covered them with cloth. When he ran out of cloth, he used straw. And that ran out, he stopped covering them. He slept in barns, in wells, on rooftops. He lost his name, lost his voice. When the town deemed the plague burned out, a bell was rung, and the barrier was called back. If he returned at all, he was left coins in a bowl outside the gate. He was never touched again, not by hand, not by glance. Some say they went mad, others say they became silent saints. All we know is they walked alone into places no one else would go and stayed. The next was a different kind of silence, the relic cleaner. In monasteries and churches across Europe, holy relics were not just kept, they were venerated, displayed, kissed, touched. But someone had to care for them. Someone had to polish the silver case that held the saint's jawbone, had to brush the dried blood from the shard of cloth said to be Christ's robe, had to remove the candle wax from the fingers of martyrs encased in glass. That person was the relic cleaner, and they were always watched, never alone, for fear they might steal or speak or see something that should not be seen. They worked in cold rooms beneath the altar, no heat, no window, just the constant press of eyes from statues and saints. They were trained to move slowly, to whisper prayers with each motion, to never question why some bones seemed different, larger, fresher. Sometimes, when they scrubbed too hard, the relic cracked, and they were beaten, not fired, just beaten, because no one else would take the job. No one else could know what they knew, that not all relics were ancient, that not all saints died centuries ago, that faith, like history, is sometimes stitched from fear. Then there was the midnight knocker, a role so feared no one claimed it voluntarily. In towns that practiced curfew under penalty of death, someone had to enforce the silence. The knocker did not speak. They wore a hood, carried no torch. They walked the streets at the last toll of the bell, and if a candle was seen in a window, they knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. If the light did not dim, the door was marked. And in the morning, the guards came. Sometimes, no one answered. Sometimes, no one was there at all. But the door was still marked, and the town remembered. Children said the knock could be heard in dreams, that if you heard it, your breath froze. That the knocker could pass through walls, it wasn't true. But the fear was, and the fear did more than punishment ever could. The knocker vanished with the rise of gaslight and printed law. But in some places, the sound still echoes 3 soft knocks and a silence that lasts forever. Then there is the mirror keeper. Found only in noble households, this profession existed for one reason: to veil the mirrors when death came. It was said that if a soul saw itself reflected in glass as it departed the body, it would be trapped forever. So when someone lay dying, the mirror keeper was summoned. They walked with linen and ash, draping every mirror, muttering prayers taught by no priest. They were not servants, not family, just a presence, like dust or wind. And when the last breath came, they stayed in the room for a full hour, watching, listening, making sure the veil did not shift, that no flicker of silver light appeared beneath the cloth, that no shadow stared back. Some said they were witches, others said they were angels. They said nothing at all, just moved on to the next house, the next mirror, the next soul trying to escape. The final profession for tonight is the whisper scribe. Employed by torturers, by priests, by kings. Their job was to record confessions, real or otherwise spoken under duress, but not with ink, with breath. They memorized. They listened to the screams, to the begging, to the lies forced from bleeding mouths. And when the condemned was gone, they repeated every word to the scribe of law, perfectly, emotionlessly, word for word. No parchment could be allowed in the chamber. Too dangerous. Too flammable, too fragile. But the whisper scribe was durable and silent. They were trained from childhood, chosen for their memory, their lack of empathy, their small stature. Many were orphans. Some were deaf, taught to read lips and repeat soundlessly. They were ghosts in human skin, present in every trial but never seen. And when they failed to remember, they were erased, like the confessions they forgot. These professions, these lives, were not accidents. They were made. By need, by fear. By the quiet machinery of a world that demanded the clean without admitting the filth required to achieve it. And we, walking now among their memories, are no longer innocent. But that's all right. Innocence is not the goal. Understanding is. We rest here. At the edge of the second gate, there are still 5 to pass. Still more names to remember. Let the silence settle. Let the weight shift. We'll continue soon. Together. Always together. We begin again. The breath deepens. The shadows return. And the footsteps we follow no longer echo in dirt or stone, but in something quieter, like the sound of hands moving across worn parchment, or the hush of prayers spoken behind closed doors. This is the third gate, and here the professions become harder to explain. Not because they were more secret, but because they were more accepted, more ordinary. And perhaps that is the most horrifying part of all. The first profession we meet is the leech keeper, not a physician, not a healer, but a servant in charge of the jars. In noble homes, monasteries, and some well-funded apothecaries, there was often a room damp, warm, and rank, filled with glass jars. Inside each one writhed several medicinal leeches, fat and glistening, slithering over one another in slow, hungry spirals. The leech keeper tended them like livestock, fed them with animal blood. Occasionally, when stocks were low, with his own, he checked their strength, cleaned their slime, replaced the water with warm rainwater or boiled spring. If a leech died, he had to slice it open to ensure it hadn't been poisoned by a diseased patient. If the leech survived too long, he starved it until it became desperate enough to bite anything. He was not trained in medicine. He did not ask questions. He only ensured that when the physician called for purification, a jar could be handed over. Cold, alive, thirsty. His hands were often covered in small wounds, circular and scabbed, from where the creatures slipped free during feeding. He stopped flinching after the first year, stopped feeling the difference between pain and obligation. Next is the teeth breaker, not the town barber surgeon, not the apothecary, but the one summoned when a mouth became a cage of agony. When the rot spread so deep the breath itself turned sour, and the pain burned through the temples like wildfire. the breaker was called. No anesthetic, no sanitation, just a wooden stool, a cloth to bite, and a set of iron pliers so stained with rust they looked carved from blood. The breaker didn't ask where the pain was. He saw it, swollen gums, bruised lips, eyes wide with panic. He knew that the first pull mattered most. If he got it right, the rest followed like rotten fruit. If he got it wrong, the patients screamed until their voice tore. Sometimes the jaw broke. Sometimes the tongue split. And still, the breaker worked. Sometimes in alleys, sometimes behind taverns, sometimes in churches when even prayer couldn't muffle the sound. He was never thanked, only paid. Often in silence, once in meat, sometimes not at all. His fingers were calloused, his ears scarred from the screams, his eyes always a little unfocused, as if he couldn't quite stop seeing what he'd done. The next figure is called the weeper, not a mourner, not a relative, a professional woman hired to cry at funerals. The louder, the better. In cities where grief was seen as both a duty and a performance, families, especially wealthy ones, would pay women to wail, tear their clothes, claw at their cheeks, and chant the names of the dead. The weeper did not know the deceased. She didn't care to. She memorized their names the night before, practiced the right cadence, learned which relatives to embrace and which to avoid. Her cries were not random, they were art, rising and falling like a song, designed to ignite emotion in others, to give permission to cry, to show the neighbors that this death mattered, that it hurt. And yet, when the procession ended, the weeper was the first to leave. She washed her face in cold water, removed the black shawl, returned home, where no one asked her how she slept. No one asked how many names she had shouted that week, or whether her voice ever trembled on its own. Then there was the tanner's child, a role not chosen, but inherited. In towns where leather was prized, and hides were shipped from the countryside in wagons that stank for miles, someone had to work the first step, the flaying. Not of the animal, that was already done, but of its memory. The child scraped the hides, removed the hair, rubbed them with lime and piss and chalk. They stirred vats that burned their skin, stood barefoot in mud so thick it sucked their feet down like hunger. They coughed constantly. Their nails turned black, their teeth loosened. Their hands shook at night, but they learned not to cry. Crying dried the throat, and the throat needed moisture to breathe through the stink. They lived near the tannery, in houses so saturated with the scent of ammonia and rot that even rats stayed away. And when they slept, they dreamed of cows screaming, even though the cows had already died long ago. No one hugged them, no one kissed their hair. Their scent lingered too long. The final profession for this part of the road is the excreta examiner, employed in courts, in monasteries, sometimes in royal households. When illness struck and physicians failed, the examiner was summoned to inspect the patient's chamber pot. Their job was to record the color, the texture, the smell, to break apart the stool with sticks, to study it for worms, for undigested seeds, for signs of curses or poison. They worked not with scalpel or scroll, but with spoon and candle, their hands permanently stained, their noses broken from constant exposure. They knew the taste of bile, the heat of fevered waste, the hollow stink of slow death. They could predict how long a man had to live just by the weight of his gut's surrender. And they were never wrong, but they were never praised either, because they worked with what others flushed away, with what was meant to be forgotten, and that made them dangerous. We pause here. At the edge of another gate, the light dimmer, the silence heavier. You've done well to come this far. But the path isn't over. There are more professions waiting, more names no one dares say aloud. But we will, slowly, quietly, together. When you're ready, we'll take the next step. We walk again, slower now, not from weariness, but because the air thickens with things no one speaks of. Not anymore, perhaps not ever. These professions were not secret in the way that they were hidden. They were secret because no one wished to name them. To name something is to give it power, to invite it to linger. And so, they remained unnamed. passed down in gestures, in locked rooms, and the glances exchanged between those who knew. The first is the bone washer. Not a gravedigger, not a mortician. The bone washer arrived after the dead were buried and long forgotten. In many parts of Europe where space was scarce and churches were small, bones were exhumed after a few years to make room for new corpses. The skeletons of the forgotten were unearthed by low-ranking monks or field hands, but they could not be used again as is. They needed to be cleaned. The flesh, already long rotted, was scraped from the crevices. The skulls were boiled, the femurs bleached. The washer's job was to make the remains presentable because they were to be stored in ossuaries, in neat rows, in catacombs, or arranged artistically in chapels to remind the living of death's constancy. The washer worked alone, beneath the church, where dampness seeped through stone and time moved differently. The bones were silent, but the washer swore they shifted sometimes, that the jaw clicked softly, that the eye sockets felt like they watched. They were never given full names, only initials, never asked questions, only given more skulls, and eventually, they learned to whisper back. Then there was the plague stitcher. In times when the sick were quarantined, en masse and coffins became a luxury. Bodies were often sewn into simple cloth shrouds, canvas, burlap, rough linen, anything that could contain what was left. The stitcher worked not in the open, but in barns, in stables, in church basements. Their hands were raw from coarse thread, their eyes bloodshot from sewing in candlelight. Each body was laid flat, arms crossed or tied, and the stitcher would sew the cloth shut from head to toe, one long line, like closing a wound. Some were so bloated, so misshapen from disease, that the cloth had to be doubled. The stitcher never flinched, only sewed, in silence. Some whispered prayers with each pass of the needle, not to honor the dead, but to keep the spirits in, because it was believed that if the cloth burst open before burial, the soul would escape and take someone with it. Their nightmares were full of seams tearing, of hands reaching through the thread. They never slept well, but they always showed up, always stitched, always silent. Next, the ash turner. In castles and abbeys, even in some towns, heating was not always cries. Rum, clean wood, or tidy coal. Bodies, animal, and sometimes human, were burned in hidden pits when no other disposal was possible. Afterward, someone had to turn the ashes, to break apart the half-burned remains, to crush the bone fragments, to sift the soot. The turner was tasked with making the unclean unrecognizable. They worked with long rods, masks soaked in vinegar, gloves that barely held together. Their work was never mentioned, though everyone knew where the warmth came from, especially in winter, when the fires never stopped and the scent of burnt flesh became familiar. They were never thanked, only avoided. The turner aged quickly, their skin gray, their lungs hollowed by soot, but they never left. There was nowhere else to go. Then, the curse washer, a role given to women often elderly, often widowed who claimed to know the signs. When a house fell ill repeatedly, or livestock were born twisted, or food spoiled overnight, someone would send for the washer. She would arrive with herbs, with salt, with water drawn from a well at midnight. She would scrub the thresholds, the doors, the beds, the walls. She would mutter in dead dialects, whisper charms, leave dolls made of straw at the corners of the house. She was not paid with coin, but with bread, with milk, with silence. And once she left, no one mentioned her again. But if the sickness lifted, they feared her. And if it didn't, they blamed her. Many were hanged, many burned. But the curse washer remained in every village, even if no one admitted it. The final profession here is the scream binder. In certain prisons, in towers built for silence, there were too many screams, too many echoes, too much madness, and so a man was hired to stop it. Not by killing, not by torture, but by capturing. The scream binder walked the corridors with strips of cloth soaked in wax and herbs. He pressed them to mouths not to kill but to quiet. He wrapped heads in layers of gauze. He poured warm wine into mouths until the throat no longer remembered how to shout. He sat beside the worst of them and hummed low, unending tones, until the sound of pain melted into sleep. He was not cruel. He was not kind. He was simply present, a constant figure in the dimness, a weight against hysteria. Over time, he lost his own voice, not from force, from choice, because to live with that much screaming meant you had to forget the sound of your own. They say his shadow still moves through the stones of certain towers, still humming, still binding what cannot be silenced. We reach the end of this stretch. The air is heavier now, saturated with the scent of ash and boiled cloth, and the silence of too many buried secrets. You've done well to stay with me. Few make it this far, but there is more, so much more. We rest here not to retreat, but to gather strength. When you are ready, we will descend again, deeper, always deeper. We return one final time to this chapter's path, and it's colder now, not in temperature, but in tone, as if the professions ahead have learned to hide not only from history, but from memory. They were not simply vile. They were not simply necessary. They were embedded, woven into the fibers of towns and cities, wrapped around the rituals of life and death so tightly that removing them would unravel something deeper. The first of these was the bell warden, not the man who rang the town bell, but the one who watched it. In many medieval cities, the bell was sacred, used to mark not just time, but birth, marriage, death, invasion, fire, plague. But bells were fickle things. They cracked, they slipped, they silenced. And so, the bell warden lived in the tower, often for years, alone. He maintained the ropes, the beams, the counterweights. He checked for rust, for bird nests, for rot. He listened to the tone of each ring and could tell, by pitch alone, whether death was near. When war came, he didn't flee. When the plague came, he rang faster. When lightning struck the steeple, he waited beneath it. Always watching, always listening. His sleep was fragmented, his spine curved from the narrow ladders, his hands bled from splinters. But he knew the bell better than any human. He claimed it spoke to him, that it warned before disaster. No one believed him, until the bell fell silent, and so did the town. The next was the bog drainer. In areas where villages bordered swamps and marshes, something had to be done about the smell, the sickness, the sinkholes. The drainer was tasked with walking into the muck, chest deep, sometimes neck deep, and digging trenches to let the water run off. He used no shoes, wore no armor, only old leathers coated in pitch. He moved slowly, deliberately, as snakes, leeches, and worse brushed against his skin. Sometimes he unearthed bones. Sometimes entire corpses preserved in peat with hair and teeth intact, staring. He had to drag them out, tie them up, report them. But he never asked who they had been, because sometimes the villagers recognized teeth he faced, and sometimes they didn't. But the body was always taken back, and the drainer returned to the swamp, always alone. Then there was the whisper collector. Employed in courts, monasteries, and the homes of nobles, this profession didn't use tools or wear a uniform. The collector was simply there, in the background, listening. Not to speeches or sermons, but to servants, to cooks, to stable boys, to the children who repeated what their parents whispered at night. The collector memorized everything. Secrets, scandals, confessions. They wrote nothing down. They told no one except their employer. And they did so not in full reports, but in sentences. The abbot drinks at night. The scribe has a sister with strange marks. The bishop dreams of fire. The collector lived in silence, ate alone, trusted no one. They were often mistaken for mad, and perhaps they were. But they were never surprised, because they knew what no one else dared say aloud. And when something terrible happened, a murder, a betrayal, a disappearance, the collector had already heard it. In whispers. Then came the silence cleaner. In monasteries devoted to strict vows of silence, sounds still existed. Footsteps, coughs, sighs. And over time, those sounds gathered in the corners of the chapel like dust. It was believed that silence could become impure, that too many unspoken thoughts held in too long, would twist the air. And so, the cleaner was sent in, always at night, alone, with only a cloth and a lamp. They walked the corridors, the scriptoriums, the cloisters, and they listened, not for sound, but for pressure, for something wrong. When they found it, they sat in that spot and waited, until it passed, or didn't. No one ever saw their face. They ate behind veils. Their room had no mirrors, because they believed that if they saw themselves, they would lose the silence and never return. Lastly, we meet the root singer. In villages that grew desperate during famine or disease, some turned to old magic, not paganism, not witchcraft, something older. The root singer was called to sing over the fields, not during harvest, but during death. When a body was buried without rites, the singer knelt at the grave and hummed low rhythmic tones. They believed this bound the soul to the earth, encouraging crops to grow from the grief. Their voice did not rise, did not vary. It was steady, like a heartbeat. The same song, over and over for hours. And when they finished, they left a bundle of roots at the headstone mandrake, wormwood, or belladonna. The villagers thanked them with silence, with averted eyes, with bread left on doorsteps. The crops often grew, but not always. And when they didn't, the singer disappeared. Another took their place. The same song, the same voice, the same roots. The air now is very still. Even in this imagined space, the silence feels earned. Because we've crossed through professions that were not only horrifying, they were necessary, integral. They held the medieval world together, one body, one whisper, one scream at a time. But the path goes deeper still, and the worst, they say, is yet to come. We'll continue slowly, steadily when you're ready. There's no rush. They've been waiting for centuries. They'll wait a little longer. We descend now into the fourth passage, and with each step the weight of time grows heavier, pressing against the bones of forgotten labor, and the rituals no longer whispered even in shadow. These were not professions in the sense we understand today. They were burdens passed like curses, inherited not through education or ambition, but through blood, silence, and necessity. Their existence was barely recorded, because to speak of them was to stain the page, to invite their presence back into the world. But they existed, and their traces remain. The first of these is the mourner for hire. In many parts of Europe, especially among the poor or the disgraced, there were no family members left to cry at a burial, no friends to attend a passing. And so, mourners were summoned. These were not actors, they were not clergy. They were specialists in grief, trained in the tones and rhythms of loss. They knew how to wail long, low sounds that curled like smoke through the cemetery air. They knew how to beat their chests, to pull their hair, to whisper the name of the dead as if it had just been spoken for the last time. They arrived before dawn and stayed until the dirt had settled. They carried with them a pouch of ash to smear on their faces and a scrap of black cloth to tie over their mouths, so that their own identity was swallowed by their mourning. No one ever asked them for their names. That wasn't part of the job. The second was the flesh divider, not the butcher, not the torturer. The divider worked in plague pits and famine ditches, where multiple bodies were thrown together, often naked, always rotting. Their task was to separate limbs, to determine which leg belonged to which torso, to arrange the bodies so they could be burned or buried in some semblance of respect. They used long poles, hooked blades, gloves soaked in lye. The stench clung to them even after days of washing. They learned to identify bone types by touch alone. They had nightmares where they were assembled wrong, where their own body parts didn't match. They stopped eating meat. They stopped eating with others. They stopped speaking altogether. The third profession was that of the plague lantern. During the worst outbreaks of pestilence, entire streets were sealed, homes locked from the outside. Those within, whether healthy or sick, were left to fate. But at night, a single figure would walk through the alleys, carrying a lantern with a blue glass pane. That was the signal. That was the sign that someone was still alive in the quarantine zone. The plague lantern was not a rescuer. He didn't break in. He didn't offer food. He only looked for movement, for flickers of candlelight behind boarded windows, for sounds that didn't belong to rats. If he saw a sign of life, he would mark the door with chalk. A single line, no name, no explanation, and he would return the next night, and the next, until the sign stopped. Then the door was burned. He was paid in coin dipped in vinegar, left in a basin that he emptied with tongs. No one saw his face. His lantern was buried with him, always. Then came the Blackwater Guide. In cities with primitive sewers and narrow streets, storms would flood the drains, pushing human waste and corpses into the lower quarters. Someone had to navigate that filth to prevent collapse, to retrieve bodies, to rescue the living. The Blackwater Guide walked waist-deep in darkness, with only a pole and a sense of memory. He knew the layout better than the architects. He could tell, by smell alone, when a tunnel had collapsed. He carried no torch, it would suffocate. He marked his path with chalk made from crushed bones. He saved hundreds. No one thanked him. No one invited him above ground. His skin blistered from the water. His lungs rotted from the fumes. He never stopped, until one night, he didn't come back. They never sent another. And finally, we meet the Hollow Priest. Not ordained, not sanctioned. The Hollow Priest was summoned only when a soul could not pass, when a dying man screamed for hours, when a child wept with voices not their own, when an entire house rotted from within. The priest arrived barefoot. He carried no book, only a bell made from melted iron and teeth. He would sit beside the afflicted and whisper a chant with no words, just breath and rhythm. He did not promise salvation. He did not speak of heaven. He only offered silence. And if the silence returned, if the house grew still, he would leave a token, an eye made of wax, a tooth carved from bone, and walk away. If it did not, he would stay, for days, for weeks, until the thing inside chose to leave, or took him instead. There was never a second visit, never a return. His name was not remembered, only his bell. And so we close this chapter with hands stained from things best left buried. We've wandered through professions that clung like rot to the fabric of medieval life, that spoke not of survival, but of endurance, of holding back the dark with nothing but breath and ritual. There are more, always more. But for now, rest. Listen. There's a sound coming from beneath the floor. We'll follow it, but not yet. Soon. We continue forward, past the doors no one ever opened, and down stairwells that creak with memory. This chapter is different. It lingers. The professions you're about to encounter were so reviled, so drenched in dread and myth, that even the most hardened chroniclers hesitated to name them aloud. These weren't just horrifying, they were contaminating. To speak of them was to draw them closer. But silence, too, has weight. And tonight, we lift it. The first is the Screamer's Keeper. Torture, in the medieval world, was rarely carried out in isolation. There were protocols, hierarchies, rituals. But the Screamer's Keeper was not a torturer. He was the one who stayed after. When the questioning ended, when the instruments were cleaned and the scribes dismissed, he remained. His role was to manage the screams that didn't stop. Some prisoners continued howling for hours, others for days. A few never stopped at all. The keeper stayed in the cell with them. He was not allowed to speak. He could not touch them. All he could do was sit, night after night, listening, measuring the pitch, the patterns, the rhythm. It was said the best keepers could identify a man's final breath 20 minutes before it came by how his scream changed. Some keepers were found years later, still in the cell, rocking slowly, mouths open, no sound emerging. The second was the leech maker, not a collector, not a healer. This was the man or woman who bred the leeches. In the dark corners of apothecaries or damp hutches outside town walls, they raised the creatures in jars of blood and pig entrails. They sang to them, whispered through the glass. It was believed that leeches responded to tone, to warmth, to hunger in a voice. The maker's hands were always cold. Their skin turned pale from lack of sun, mottled from small bites that never quite healed. They smelled of copper and rot. Children whispered that they fed the leeches from their own veins, that they named them, that they let them sleep on their skin at night. There was one story of a town where every healer vanished, and only the maker remained. When the townsfolk finally opened the door to his hut, there were no bones, just a floor alive with wet, pulsing things, and a lullaby echoing through the rafters. The third was the last tooth man. In communities where dental care was a myth and infection a certainty, the extraction of teeth fell to one soul, the tooth man. But this one was special. He came only after death. His duty was not to relieve pain, but to harvest. It was believed that if a corpse still held its teeth, the soul would speak too freely in the afterlife, that confessions, curses, and secrets could slip out. So the last tooth man visited graves. He waited until the moon was high, until the dirt settled soft. He dug with care, opened the mouth, and took only the teeth. He placed them in a velvet pouch, sorted by size and stain. No one knew where the teeth went. Some said they were ground into powder and blown across thresholds to ward off spirits. Others believed they were fed to birds who carried messages to the dead. The tooth man himself never spoke. He wore a mask stitched from linen and thread. He never returned the same way twice. The fourth was the laugh counter. In courts obsessed with decorum, there was fear not of silence, but of laughter. Uncontrolled laughter. Inappropriate laughter. It was believed to signal madness, possession, or treason. So the laugh counter was assigned to sit in assemblies, in feasts, in sermons. Their job, to count. Each laugh, each smirk, each twitch of a lip. They wore no uniform. They blended in. And when a threshold was crossed, when too many laughs erupted in too short a time, they reported it. Sometimes, those they reported were exiled. Other times, executed. The counter did not smile, did not blink. It said they trained themselves by staring into polished silver for hours, whispering jokes until nothing moved in their own face. The fifth was the cold binder. This was a task reserved for those who lived near rivers, lakes, or snow-fed streams. In winter, when the ground froze too solid to dig, bodies could not be buried. So the cold binder was summoned. Their job, to bind the dead in ice. They arranged corpses on slabs of stone or thick boards, drenched them in freezing water, packed snow into their mouths, their eyes, their chests, then sealed them in caves, barns, or cellars, whispering prayers to keep the spirit tethered until thaw. It was dangerous work. If the body thawed too soon, it was believed the soul escaped in confusion. If the ice cracked wrong, it echoed like a scream, and the binder had to start again. Some said their hands became so numb, they no longer felt warmth even in summer. The cold binder lived alone, always. Sometimes in spring, villagers found them encased in ice beside the dead, holding hands. The final profession tonight is the bone clockmaker. He made no clocks, not in the usual sense. Instead, he used bones, human and animal, to build contraptions that ticked. Ribs became gears, fingers became levers, jawbones swung like pendulums. These clocks did not measure time. They measured something else. Dread, perhaps, or memory. They were set in motion only after a tragedy, a fire, a flood, a massacre. The ticking was soft, irregular. But the townsfolk believed that when the ticking stopped, the sorrow passed. The clockmaker never sold his creations. He placed them at thresholds, at altars, at the foot of beds. He disappeared before dawn. Sometimes, a new one appeared years later, ticking slowly, counting something no one could name. And when it stopped, something else began. You feel it now, don't you? That soft pulse in the air, that pressure behind the eyes. The awareness that these professions may have vanished, but the need for them has not. They were strange, terrible, but they served a function. They kept the balance. They watched the seams of the world, where silence, phrase, and madness seeps through. We're not done yet. The worst of them waits in the next room. But we won't open that door tonight. Not yet. Sleep now. The door is listening. We have wandered far now, past doors carved with warnings and wells that no longer echo, and yet there is still deeper to go. You may feel the weight of these stories settling behind your eyes, a quiet ache pressing against the back of your throat, not from fear, but from recognition. These professions were not fiction. They were necessities. Someone had to do them. And when we deny that need, when we pretend it never existed, we forget how close we remain to that darkness. The first profession of this final chapter is the widow feeder. In parishes where the old rites still held sway, a widow was not permitted to cook her first meal after the burial of her husband. It was said her sorrow would poison the food, her hands too burdened with grief to stir properly, to season with care. Instead, the widow feeder arrived before dawn, cloaked and silent, and prepared a single dish of porridge made with bone broth, stale bread, and herbs gathered at dusk. She spoke no words. She would not look the widow in the eyes. She left the bowl at the threshold, turned, and walked away. If the food was consumed, the widow would be left in peace. If it was left to rot, the feeder returned the next night, and the next, until something changed, or until the house stood empty. Some said the widow feeders were once widows themselves, trapped in the cycle of loss, bound to feed sorrow so it would not consume others. The second was the grave choir. This was not a choir in the way you understand it. These were singers, yes, but their voices were used only once, during a burial of a child. Each town had one or two chosen singers, trained from youth. Their voices shaped through ritual and silence. They were forbidden to speak between births and deaths. When a child passed, the choir gathered around the grave and sang not hymns, not chants, but a single note, held as long as their breath allowed, then repeated again and again. The sound was said to guide the soul toward rest, to soothe the earth as it closed. If the child had died suddenly, the note was higher. If slowly, lower. After the burial, the singers would not speak for 3 days. Some lost their voices entirely. Some wandered from the village and never returned. The third was the pig skinner's shadow. The pig skinner was common enough a bloody trade, loud and fast. But the shadow was something else. He arrived after the skinner was done. His job was not to butcher, but to gather what was left. The scraps, the sinews, the blood. He carried a pail made of skulls and a blade too thin to cut anything living. He scraped the wooden tables clean, collected every thread of viscera, and returned to his hut, where he boiled the remnants into a paste used for tanning, for candles, for ink. It was said that if you wrote a confession in the shadow's ink, the page could not be burned. The confession would remain, black and slick, even if the paper turned to ash. The fourth profession was the threshold warden. In times of famine, towns often sealed their gates not just against outsiders, but against their own. The sick, the mad, the cursed. The warden stood not at the outer gate, but at the edge of each home, watching for signs that someone inside had turned strange. He listened through the shutters. He measured the footprints in the mud. If a pattern shifted, if the steps became erratic or vanished entirely, he left a stone marked with ash on the doorstep. If it was gone by morning, the home was spared. If not, the door was nailed shut. The warden never carried weapons. His power was in silence, in knowing who had changed and when. Some said he was blind. Others said he had no eyes, only dark pits that reflected your own fear. The fifth was the hollow midwife. Not every birth ended in life. Not every mother was meant to scream. The hollow midwife was called when the breath did not come, when the silence stretched too long. She arrived barefoot, hands wrapped in cloth soaked in winter herbs. Her duty was not to deliver, but to collect. The stillborn were placed in her arms, and she carried them to a place no one spoke of: a room behind a chapel, a tree deep in the woods, a hollow beneath the hearth. She sang to them, not lullabies, but low, wordless ums. She wrapped them in moss, in ash, in petals gathered before sunrise, and then she disappeared. No one knew where the bodies went. Some believed they were buried in salt. Others said they became birds. The hollow midwife was never seen twice in the same place. The final profession we visit tonight is the echo trapper. There were valleys where sound behaved strangely, where a whisper could be heard days later, where a scream never stopped bouncing. In such places, madness grew. So the echo trapper was trained to capture sound. He carried a frame of bent wood and strings soaked in wax. At dusk, he walked the ridges, holding the frame before him, tuning it like an instrument, listening for echoes that didn't belong. When he found one, he struck the strings. If the frame vibrated, the echo was caught. He would seal the frame in a bag stitched from mute tongues and bury it beneath a stone marked with silence. No one dared dig them up. It was said that if you broke the frame, the sound would return louder than before, filled with the voices of the dead. And so we leave this chamber behind, but we do not forget it. These were not merely professions. They were rituals, offerings, acts of quiet defiance against the chaos of the world. They remind us that behind every civilization lies 1,000 unspoken agreements, 1,000 hands keeping the dark at bay. You've walked far tonight. Rest now. The air is still. But listen, just below the silence, there's a hum. Something turning. A sound that's waiting to be caught. We'll find it. Soon. But not yet. We go deeper still, past what was spoken, past what was written, down into the marrow of memory, where even the dust has forgotten the names. This chapter begins with the Whisper Tallyman. In ancient border towns where war was less a threat and more a season, there was always a need to track the rumors who was preparing, who had fled, who had killed. But it wasn't scribes who did this. It was the tallyman. He walked markets with chalk in his pocket and parchment stitched inside his sleeves. He asked no questions. He never stopped moving. He simply listened. For every whisper of betrayal, he made a mark. For every mention of blood, another. He recorded patterns, how often a name returned, how loud the voice had grown. The more marks, the closer the reckoning. If he returned to the guardhouse with more than 10 slashes on a single page, a village was burned before dawn. If he returned with a blank page, his own throat was cut. For silence was more dangerous than speech. The second was the bone washer. Not a gravedigger, not a priest. This was the one who came years after the burial, when the coffin collapsed and the soil swallowed what remained. In some traditions, bones were not left in the ground. They were exhumed, cleaned, and placed in ossuaries, stacks of anonymous limbs arranged like libraries. The bone washer was tasked with removing every scrap of flesh, with oiling the joints so they would not crack, with brushing the skulls until they shone in torchlight. She worked in silence, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Her tools were blades of fishbone, cloth soaked in vinegar, brushes made of horsehair. If she found a bone out of place, a rib tucked beneath the pelvis, a tooth inside the eye socket, she whispered to it an apology or a question no one knew. It was said that the best washers could hear the memories still clinging to the marrow, and that their dreams were filled with voices not their own. The third was the candlemonger. In monasteries plagued by rot, where mold bloomed like ink across every surface and cold seeped from stone into breath, candles were both light and warning. But not all candles burned evenly. Some flickered when spirits stirred. Some bent when death approached. The longer's job was to test them. He breathed on the wick, long and slow. If the flame split, he sang. If it curled, he wept. He walked through cloisters at night, lunging at each candle with a soft exhale, listening to what the wax revealed. His lungs grew heavy, his voice thin. It was believed that every breath he gave to the flame took something from him in return. When he died, the monks placed a candle in his throat. It burned for 3 days, and then was gone. The fourth was the mute herald, a contradiction, and yet real. In castles where betrayal was common and trust scarce, news was too dangerous to be spoken. The mute herald carried only his eyes. He delivered messages through gaze, through gesture, through carefully folded cloth soaked in dye. Red for birth, black for death, yellow for war. He rode alone, even in snow, even at night. His tongue had been removed as a child, so his voice would never be tempted. Those who received his message could ask one question. He answered only with a nod. Once, it was said, a lord struck him in anger for bringing word of a lost battle. The next morning, the lord's tongue was missing too. No wound, no blood, just silence. Tea. He fifth was the draught shamer. In cities where water ran dry, wells became altars, and those who wasted even a drop were seen as cursed. The draught shamer followed them. He carried a bell that rang without touch, and a mask of copper that reflected the face of the accused. When someone was seen spilling, or hoarding, or drinking alone, the shamer appeared. He did not speak. He simply stood outside their home, the bell ringing softly, the mask shining. Some wept, some fled. A few tried to strike him, but the mask never cracked. It was said that beneath it was nothing, no face, no skin, just thirst. When the rains returned, the shamer vanished. No one knew where he went, but his bell echoed in wells for weeks after. The final profession for this chapter is the bloodweaver. A woman in the hills, always. She wove not with wool, but with threads soaked in blood animal, sometimes human. Her tapestries were not art, they were maps, patterns that revealed who would die next. When a plague came, the villagers brought her rats. When a war came, they brought teeth. She boiled them down, spun them into strands, and sat at her loom. The images changed with the moon. A child alone in a doorway, a soldier on fire, a well filled with hair. Those who saw the tapestries left offerings, coins, milk, teeth. They never asked questions, they never returned twice. One day, the loom stood empty. Just a tapestry hanging in the wind, threads bleeding into the dirt. And so we close another chamber of this terrible archive, where memory curls like smoke and every breath tastes of rust. These professions weren't myths. They were mirrors, strange, dark, and necessary. Sleep now. The bell has stopped, but something still moves in the well. Beneath the moss and the cracked stones of forgotten hamlets lay roles too grotesque to carry names, tasks that no child ever dreamed of and no adult ever admitted to knowing. Yet someone performed them, not for glory or coin, but because if they didn't, the rot would rise. The first profession of this chapter was the sleep knocker. You've heard of night watchmen, perhaps even town criers, but the sleep knocker was neither. This figure walked the narrowest alleys of plagued cities, where sleep was not safety, but a gamble with death. If someone slept too long, they risked slipping into what the physicians called death sleep, a coma-like stupor that mimicked mortality. The knocker carried a bone rod and a pouch of soot. Every hour he tapped on shutters and whispered names into the cracks of the wood. He had memorized the names of every soul still breathing in his ward. If a name changed, if the cadence felt wrong, or the syllables tasted unfamiliar on his tongue, he left soot on the doorstep. The soot meant the sleeper had crossed. Inside the homes, people lay with coins over their eyes, unsure if the next knock would be real. It was said the sleep knocker's voice grew quieter each night, not from exhaustion, but because he was slowly forgetting his own name. The second was the nail counter, not a carpenter, not a merchant, but a silent figure who appeared after battles, when the dead were gathered in carts and carried toward burning pits. He knelt beside each corpse, removed the boots, and counted the nails. If a foot was missing, he marked a scroll. If a nail was blackened or missing, he whispered the number aloud. Why? Because in ancient belief, it was said the soul escaped through the extremities and the toes, being the farthest from the heart, were the final barrier. When nails blackened, it meant the soul had stayed too long. When they vanished entirely, it meant something else had taken it. Nail counters were blind. Their fingers did the seeing. And after each tally, they dipped their hands in salt water and wine, muttering prayers they did not understand. The third was the mourner's leech. While priests gave sermons and gravediggers swung shovels, this figure moved among the mourners, silent and slow. He wore robes dyed with indigo, and a mask, shaped like a face, caught mid-sob. Hanging from his belt were pouches filled with dried herbs and leeches wrapped in silk. His job? To ensure the grief did not fester. Too much sorrow, they believed, could curdle the blood, summon wraiths, cause rot in the bones. So the mourner's leech chose one mourner per funeral and drained them 1 cup of blood, just enough to prevent madness. It was seen as a mercy. Those chosen felt lighter afterward, and some even laughed. But the leech's own veins grew thick with sorrow. He changed masks every moon, and none who saw his face ever described it the same way. The fourth was the cloister turner. In monasteries where the dead outnumbered the living, a single monk was assigned the task of turning every book, page by page, once a week. Not to read them, just to let the words breathe. Ink, they believed, could trap spirits. A page left closed too long might seal a memory, a curse, a forgotten name seeking voice. The turner moved from shelf to shelf, fingertip wrapped in cloth soaked in oil. He never read, never paused. His only task was to turn, then close. Turn, then close. If he turned a page and found a word missing, he recited the Psalms backward until the ink returned. If it didn't, the book was burned. Turners rarely spoke. Over time, they began to speak only in syllables of books long burned. Some believed the pages were turning them. The fifth was the ember gleaner. After great fires, when ash coated the bones of cities, a lone figure in charred rags would appear at dawn. He carried a sieve of bone and a rake of antler. His task was to find what still glowed. Not flame, but ember-small coals, hidden heat. He whispered to the ash, coaxing light from death. Embers were seen as sacred. They could be used to relight hearths, to bless cradles, to curse enemies. The gleaner placed them in pouches of wet moss and vanished before noon. Children who followed him claimed he left no footprints, only scorch marks. The final profession tonight is the bellmender's twin. No bellmender worked alone. Ever. When one struck the bell to test its tone, the other stood outside the chapel listening. But the twin had another role, unspoken. If the bell cracked not from use, but from grief, a phenomenon known only to a few, the twin rang it one final time at midnight, alone. Then he buried the clapper in a field of silence. No birds, no wells, no echo. The spot changed with each generation. If someone found it and spoke aloud, their voice would never carry again. Bell menders aged fast. Their twins aged backward. Or so the story went. And thus we finish another descent. These professions were not taught. They were inherited, whispered, sworn upon beds of salt and soot. They remind us that even silence must be tended, even mourning must be harvested. Sleep now, let the soot settle on your tongue. If you wake and find it gone, the knocker has passed your door. A remembers you, for now. In the forgotten corridors of Europe's rural shadowlands, there were professions whose titles were never etched into ledgers or grave markers, for to name them was to give them form, and to give them form was to invite them closer. The first of this final triad was the coal midwife. In mining towns that burrowed into the earth like veins into flesh, every collapse, every flood, every coughing death of the black lung left behind not only widows, but echoes. The coal midwife was summoned not to assist with life, but to manage birth of sorrow. Dressed in burlap robes and with her face covered in a cloth dampened with ink, she entered the home of the newly bereaved. She did not speak. She lit no candles. She carried a tallow doll, its face marked with ash. She placed it at the hearth and sat with the widow, staring into the cold, soot-filled fire pit. No food was prepared, no prayers were uttered. When the silence thickened enough to press against the walls, the midwife stood, retrieved the doll, and left. It was said she absorbed the grief into the cloth of her face, and that her own sorrow became heavier with each visit. The second was the rafter caller. In medieval inns built too quickly with green wood and rushed labor, rafters creaked not just from weather, but from voices. It was believed that the souls of those murdered in their sleep, especially when blood soaked into the beams, remained suspended in the ceiling, whispering down into the beds below. The rafter caller's job was not exorcism. It was negotiation. Arriving before dusk, they lay on the inn's uppermost floor, ear pressed to the rafter, eyes closed. They murmured questions. What do you want? Who did this to you? What price will quiet you? Sometimes the rafter answered with a groan, sometimes with a knock, sometimes not at all. If the caller received no answer by sunrise, the room was to be sealed. But if the rafter moaned thrice in the same pitch, the bed beneath it was considered safe for one night. Rafter callers rarely lived past 30. Their hearing became too attuned to wood, and they began hearing rafters in places with no roofs. The third was the vain scribe. In towns where curses were as common as lice and old women were feared more than wolves, the vain scribe was the final recourse of the accused. When someone was suspected of being cursed, marking cattle with disease, souring milk, summoning sleep paralysis, the village brought them to the scribe. He worked in a cellar lit only by moss candles. The accused was stripped and strapped to a table of yew wood. The scribe traced every visible vein with red chalk. If the lines formed patterned spirals, runes, familiar faces, it was deemed proof of dark pact. If they didn't, the chalk was washed away with vinegar and silence. The scribe never looked into the eyes of the accused. His own eyelids were sewn shut with silk thread, so he could see only veins, only patterns. He claimed this let him see the truth of blood. No one ever unstitched his eyes, not even in death. The fourth was the chime drainer. In towns plagued by madness, where bells rang not on the hour but on the whim of unseen hands, there was always one man or woman tasked with removing the sounds from broken minds. The drainer carried a long brass funnel and a jar of honey wax. At sunset, they visited the afflicted, those who screamed at corners or sang to walls. They placed the funnel gently in the ear and whispered lullabies learned from bells themselves. After a minute, they poured the wax in, sealing the song inside. If done properly, the patient slept soundly and never heard bells again, but sometimes the wax bubbled. Those cases required burial before dawn. It was believed the drainer's own dreams sounded like entire cathedrals collapsing in harmony. The fifth profession was the hearth splitter. In winters so cold that breath froze midair and wolves died with their mouths open, homes became tombs. Families sometimes perished in their sleep of smoke, of cold, of despair. The hearth splitter's role began in early spring. He entered these homes alone, carrying a single axe carved with names. He approached the hearth and split it down the center. If the wood cracked cleanly, it meant the souls inside had departed. If it splintered or bled soot, it meant someone still lingered. In such cases, he recited a verse in a dead tongue and left a coin on the ashes. That coin was never to be touched, ever. The splitter's axe was passed from father to son, never sharpened, never cleaned. It grew heavier with each season. The final profession for this chapter is the quiet host. Rare, unsettling, and whispered about only in late hours, the quiet host lived at the edges of towns. They were paid not in coin, but in memory. When someone committed an unspeakable act, a murder, a betrayal, a failure so deep it could not be voiced, they went to the host. The host welcomed them in, offered tea brewed from forget-me-not flowers and crushed moonseed, and sat across the table. No words were spoken, just 1 hour of shared silence. The host absorbed the memory, pulling it from the breath and the trembling hands of the guest. In return, the guest left with only the shape of guilt, not the content. But the host? The host remembered everything. They grew paler, thinner, their eyes hollowed by the weight of thousands of borrowed sins. Some say when the host finally dies, the ground beneath their house cracks open, and the screams of 1,000 forgotten truths rise like steam. And now, as the coals dim and the wind hisses through the shutters of time, we close this fifth descent into the pit of forgotten vocations, professions not meant to be learned, only endured. You've come far. Rest now. If your home groans tonight, it may not be settling wood. Listen carefully. Some rafters still remember. In the endless catacombs of medieval existence, beyond the reach of candles and cloisters, there lay professions so deeply buried in shame and necessity that no parchment dared document them. These were not roles assigned, but burdens inherited, passed from mouth to ear like curses, or clung to in desperation by those cast too far from the warmth of the hearth. The first among them tonight was the soot feeder. In cities where chimneys twisted like black veins across the skyline and hearths burned with foul coal stolen from grave hills, the soot did not simply drift, it nested. Inside the walls, in the lungs and the folds of bread. When a household began coughing blood, or when the youngest child stopped dreaming, they summoned the feeder. He came not with tools, but with breath. Thin, sunken, with fingers like twigs, he entered the home and inhaled the soot directly from the hearth, from beneath the floorboards, from the mouths of the dying. He coughed it into silk sacks, his lips black, his eyes yellowing. The soot, once captured, was buried deep in salt pits or thrown into the rivers where fish no longer swam. No one spoke to the feeder. No one touched him. It was said he drank only milk mixed with ash, and that his own shadow had long since stopped following him. The second was the candle biter. In monasteries where silence was law and the word was divine, candles were the only source of light. But light in such places was rationed not by wax, but by sin. Each sin confessed, each impure thought whispered in the dark, required a flame to carry it upward. But the monks feared wasted light, so the candle-biter was born, blindfolded, his mo bound in iron wire during the day. He was unshackled only when a confession ended. Then he bit the candle not to extinguish it, but to consume it. Wax melted into his tongue, dripping down his throat. The light flickered violently and vanished inside him. It was believed that when he died, he would glow for 7 nights, burning from within with the burden of others' darkness. The third was the whisper hook. This profession thrived in dungeons and debtors' holes where words were more dangerous than blades. When a prisoner refused to speak, whether from fear, defiance, or madness, the whisper hook was called. Dressed in wool soaked in vinegar, he carried no blades, no fire, no weights. Just a thin bronze rod with a curled hook at the end and a leather sack of moth wings. He would sit across from the silent one and release the moth wings into the air, speaking softly, recounting forgotten nursery rhymes, prayers twisted into riddles. When the prisoner leaned forward to listen, even slightly, he reached with the hook not to harm, but to snatch the whisper from the air. It was said the hook could catch words before they reached ears, and that each phrase caught was kept in jars sealed with wax and silence. Some jars were buried beneath cathedrals, others were traded to kings, but no one ever opened them. The fourth was the bone or gainer. In churches where relics were power and every finger bone of a saint could ward off plague, someone had to assemble the unassembled. The organer worked in the crypts, often chained to the stone to prevent theft or panic. Before him lay piles of bones, real, fake, stolen, or broken, and beside him, a book of impossible diagrams, part scripture, part madness. His task was to rebuild saints, to make them whole. He filed thigh bones to match elbows, twisted spines into halos, and filled gaps with wax sculpted in the image of suffering. When he finished, the relic was sealed in glass and blessed, but he was never allowed to see it displayed. His eyes were smeared with charcoal and covered with sackcloth. If he ever gazed upon his own creation, it was said his bones would begin to disassemble within him, joint by joint, until he returned to the pile. The fifth was the cry sifter. Some towns believed that grief could poison wells, that too many tears cried into soil could summon drownings. So the cry sifter stood outside funeral processions, collecting tears in thin bowls made of stone salt. When the weeping ended, she examined each bowl under moonlight. Clear tears were safe, cloudy ones cursed. She sifted the liquid through linen laced with poppy and bone dust. If the cloth darkened, the tears were burned. If it remained pale, they were poured onto thorn bushes, which were said to feed on sorrow. Cry sifters were always women, always widows, always silent. No one knew where they lived. Some said they slept in abandoned bell towers, feeding pigeons with salt-crusted bread. The sixth and final for tonight, the hush fetcher. In towns where secrets bred like rats, and the weight of untold stories thickened the air, the hush fetcher walked barefoot. He listened at windows for sighs too long, doors that creaked after midnight, names spoken in empty rooms. He knocked not to speak, but to offer. A black pouch, stitched with hair, always the same size, always warm. The occupant took it, placed it beneath their pillow, and slept. By morning, the secret was gone, but so was something else. A memory, a scar, a sense of direction. The hush fetcher returned weeks later. If the pouch was empty, he nodded and left. If it pulsed, if it wept, he swallowed it whole. They say his stomach held cities worth of shame. He never aged, never bled. And when he died, his body turned to paper, filled with names written in ink no one could read. Now, close your eyes. Let the stillness return. These roles, these shadow professions, did not survive time because time rejected them. They live only in whispers, in soot, in the pages that refuse to stay blank. Sleep now. If your pillow feels warm tonight, do not move it. Someone else may be borrowing your silence. In the soot-choked gaps between belief and desperation, where the cold fingers of medieval society could no longer reach but where silence refused to settle, there existed professions forged not by trade but by taboo. These were the crafts of the unspeakable, born in the spaces where language failed and only gesture, ritual, and inherited dread remained. The first was the leech singer. In marsh villages surrounded by rot and ruled by humidity, the air was said to carry invisible spirits that burrowed into blood. When fever struck and leeches failed to draw the sickness away, the villagers summoned the singer. Thin and expressionless, she arrived barefoot with hair shaved unevenly and fingernails painted in dried toad ink. She did not speak. Instead, she hummed, a low, throaty drone that mimicked the sound of insects mating. One by one, she placed leeches along the spine of the afflicted and whispered into their bodies not words, but sounds, syllables too old for scripture and too soft for echo. The leeches, entranced, swelled rapidly, turning from black to purple to translucent white. When the humming stopped, they dropped off and curled into the shape of a spiral. These were buried at crossroads or burned in salt. The singer's fee was never paid in coin. She asked for tears. Just one from each family member. She kept them in vials around her waist. It was said the vials never dried. The second was the rot plucker. In plague-struck towns where the dead outnumbered the living, where no priest dared to walk and even crows circled from a distance, the rot plucker moved like smoke. Dressed in a robe woven from sailcloth and soaked in pitch, he carried tongs carved from antler and a sack lined with the petals of dead lilies. His role was not to bury, not to bless, but to retrieve specifically. The rot that clung to the lips, the fingertips, the belly buttons. It was believed that if this rot remained, the body would rise not as ghost, not as corpse, but as hollow. The rot plucker knelt beside the dead, whispered a riddle only he knew, and with a gentle tug removed the rot. It pulsed, as if resisting. If it hissed, he placed it in the sack. If it wept, he left it. Those ones were already too late. No one watched him work. Those who did, it was said, dreamed of their own mouths filling with mud. The third was the soul divider. Sometimes a person's evil could not be explained too sudden, too violent, too unlike the boy who used to feed stray cats, or the woman who baked without measuring. When this happened, the village whispered, "His soul is tangled." The divider came from the woods, barefoot and crowned in silver thorns. She carried no tools, only a mirror made from water and glass blackened with soot. The afflicted was brought to her shack. No words were exchanged. She placed the mirror before them and waited. If their reflection blinked out of sync, she began the ritual. She poured red wine into the mirror and lit a wick made from bone hair. The reflection changed not to a demon or a monster, but to a second self, one smaller, hunched, crying. She reached into the wine and pulled out a thread. It was invisible, but she tugged it gently until the reflection faded. The person never remembered what happened after, but they woke with blood under their nails and the scent of burned feathers in their lungs. The fourth was the Hollow Tamer. Deep in monasteries where monks were forbidden to speak even to God aloud, some lost their words altogether. These monks wandered into the stone gardens at night, mouths open, eyes rolling upward, bodies stiff. They became hollows living, breathing vessels filled with other people's silence. The tamer's job was to retrieve them. She did not wear robes, but feathers, and her voice was a whistle, shaped through reed flutes tied to her wrists. She never touched the monks. She danced around them in circles, blowing sharp patterns into the air, drawing their attention until their feet moved, then their hands, and finally their voices cracked into moans. Once they moaned, they could be taken back. Those who did not moan were left, and in the mornings, they were always gone. The fifth was the Worm Reaper. In towns where crops failed every year, where graves leaked into fields and children were born with teeth, it was said the worms were not natural. They fed not on earth, but on memory. The Reaper arrived when all other prayers failed. Wearing a mask made from fishbone and goat horn, he moved through the fields barefoot, dragging behind him a sack filled with dust from 7 graveyards. At night, he lay flat in the field and pressed his ear to the soil. When he heard the worms moving, not crawling, but whispering, he sang. The song had no melody, just a sequence of numbers. 1, 1, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. The worms responded. They rose to the surface, long and red as ropes. He collected them in a clay urn and sealed it with wax and rosemary. The urn was buried beneath the largest oak tree, which would die within the week. But the village would thrive until the next season. The sixth profession of this chapter was the lantern bather. There were wells in the forest, older than towns, older than maps. Some believed they granted wishes. Others knew better. When a child vanished or a woman went mad beneath the full moon, the villagers found wax at their doorstep, a candle bent into a figure 8. That meant it was time to summon the bather. She arrived naked except for a shroud of glass beads. Her body was covered in scars that glowed under certain stars. She carried a lantern filled not with fire but with the breath of stillborns. At the cursed well, she descended until her feet touched the black water. She raised the lantern and let it hover just above the surface. If the water shimmered, the missing would return. If it boiled, the village had to burn a house that night. The bather never spoke. Her payment was blood, always from a rooster, always on the new moon. And so the cycle of unspoken roles turns once more. These professions defy time not because they endure, but because time refuses to admit they ever existed. Close your eyes now. If your dreams smell of feathers or soot, you've listened too closely. Sleep anyway. Some truths are only dangerous when remembered. In the damp and creaking shadows of medieval life, where candles melted faster than hope and the line between superstition and necessity vanished with every dying bell, there were roles reserved not for the brave or the holy, but for the broken, those too fractured to fit among bakers or blacksmiths, yet too necessary to be buried with the cursed. The first profession tonight is the veil stitcher. In towns where stillborns arrived too often, and women began to dream of their unborn children crying in the dark, the people whispered of a thin curtain between the living and the almost born. The veil stitcher was summoned when that curtain tore. Dressed in robes sewn from funeral wrappings and dull fabric, they arrived only at night. They carried a curved bone needle, a spool of black lamb-gut thread, and a pail of graveyard dew. At the bedside of the grieving, they did not speak. They unrolled a tapestry made from silence itself, soft, colorless, impossibly cold, and began to stitch. Not fabric, but air. They moved their hands through the empty space where the soul had once struggled and pulled thread across invisible rips, tying off tears with knots too small to see. When they finished, they placed a drop of dew beneath the mother's tongue. She slept, always without dreaming. The second profession was the murmur weaver. In castles where paranoia crept faster than rats, and where every servant's footstep was interpreted as betrayal, kings and lords began to fear the one thing they could never cage words. The weaver was brought in secret, hooded and blindfolded, and escorted directly to the throne room's tapestry gallery. There they spun no thread, but sound. Sitting in the center of the floor, surrounded by copper bowls filled with sand, ash, teeth, and burnt scroll fragments, they hummed in a pattern known only to them. Slowly, the sounds in the castle changed. Footsteps became murmurs. Cries for help turned to rustling wind. Secrets whispered behind stone walls twisted into lullabies about drowning. The weaver remained in the gallery for weeks, living off dust milk and beetroot water. When they emerged, they had forgotten their own name. But the Lord slept better, until the walls began whispering back. The third was the Scar Harvester. Some wounds, villagers believed, remembered too much. A scar that itched during thunderstorms. A burn that ached when the moon was high. These were not reminders, they were parasites. When these scars began to bleed on their own, the harvester was summoned. Wearing gloves made from eel skin and an apron stained with old vinegar, they arrived at dusk and asked a single question. Where does it sing? Once answered, they traced the scar with a feather dipped in tar, then placed a flat stone against it. If the stone warmed, the scar was ready. They peeled it away, not the skin, but the memory, folded it like parchment, and stored it inside a leather-bound tome they never opened. When asked where the scars went, the harvester simply said, somewhere quieter. The fourth was the cradle breaker. In towns where infants cried without breath, where lullabies turned sour and windows opened by themselves during snow, mothers spoke the name only in terror. The cradle breaker arrived in silence, never knocking, always appearing in the corner of the nursery before the first candle burned down. She wore an apron made of cradle wood and a necklace strung with tiny pillow buttons. Her hands, always wrapped in linen, never touched the child. Instead, she lifted the cradle and whispered a single word into it. The wood cracked, always once, sometimes twice. If the child survived until dawn, the curse was broken. If not, the child was buried with the cradle's remains, so they could not return. The breaker accepted no payment, but she left behind a single thread of her hair, tied to the doorframe. The fifth was the flesh recorder. In courts where confession could not be trusted, where spies were too clever and the innocent too fearful, a new method of truth was needed. The recorder stood at the center of a torch-lit hall, surrounded by judges who spoke not a word. Before them, the accused stood naked, not in shame, but in surrender. The recorder approached with a long scroll of vellum and a blade sharpened on the tongue of a hanged man. With each shallow cut, they wrote not symbols, not letters, but marks. The skin became the testimony. If the bleeding stopped quickly, the truth was deemed pure. If it ran too long, the body was buried beneath the court floor. But if the marks glowed under moonlight, the accused was released and the recorder disappeared for 7 years. The final profession in this descent is the light drinker. Deep in abbeys where candles were rationed and sunbeams were hoarded like relics, it was believed that too much light could poison the soul. When a monk grew too cheerful, too eager, too talkative, the light drinker was summoned. They wore robes stitched with obsidian shards and gloves dipped in pitch. Entering the monk's chamber, they placed a mirror on the floor, not to reflect, but to absorb. They opened the shutters fully and let the sun strike the mirror, then sat cross-legged and stared into it for hours. Slowly, their pupils widened. The room dimmed. The monk grew silent, then tearful, then calm. When the mirror turned black, the ritual was complete. The drinker took the mirror with them, always covering it in velvet. Rumor says they kept dozens of them, buried beneath a vineyard where no grapes ever grew. As the night deepens, let your thoughts drift with these ghosts of history. The professions we forget are the ones that worked in silence, that bled in corners, that stitched the seams of madness so we could pretend to be whole. Sleep now. If your shadow seems lighter tomorrow, do not search for it. Perhaps someone drank it while you dreamed. In the final folds of medieval existence, in the long twilight where sin and servitude bled together, and where absolution was often more feared than punishment, a darker class of professions emerged, one so vile, so unfathomably cruel in practice and purpose, they were hidden even from folklore. These were not roles a person was born into. These were fates assigned by dreams, by omens, by the weight of curses too stubborn to die. And as we drift deeper, we begin with the first, the silence eater. In villages where the dead never stayed buried quietly, where graves moaned during full moons and the wind carried whispers from beneath the soil, the people spoke of voices that clung to the air like rot to cloth. When a family reported hearing their ancestors speak in the clatter of dishes or the crackle of firewood, the silence eater was summoned. Arriving barefoot and dressed in mourning lace that covered their entire body like a cocoon, they carried a sealed clay pot and a bronze tongue. At the hearth of the haunted home, they placed the pot in the fire and whispered a lullaby backwards into it. Slowly, smoke began to rise in the shape of human mouths, dozens, sometimes hundreds, all whispering at once. The eater held up the bronze tongue and touched it to each mouth. With every touch, a sharp breath was drawn into the eater's own lungs, and the whisper vanished. This went on until the pot turned black. Then, with a trembling hand, they sealed the lid and walked away. If you opened the pot, the voices would scream all at once, and your heart would stop. The eater never stayed long. Too many voices, and they themselves would become the next mouth in the smoke. The second profession was the widow's midwife. In towns where war was endless and the number of widows outnumbered the living children, there was a belief that sorrow could impregnate the body. When a widow began to show signs of pregnancy without having lain with a man, the town grew afraid. If they whispered of shadows crawling under her bed sheets or her belly pulsing at night like it held more than life, the midwife was summoned. She came wrapped in wolf pelts and wore a necklace of copper coins, one from each woman she had helped before. She brought with her two items, a black candle carved from marrow and a pair of tongs forged from the metal of discarded wedding bands. The birth was not done in bed, but in the cellar, beside the bones of the deceased husband. If the baby cried like a child, it was spared. If it laughed like a man, it was taken. No one asked what she did with those that laughed. The third was the grin forger. In courts ruled by cruel kings who desired eternal flattery, nobles were ordered to smile in the presence of their liege no matter the suffering, the disease, the despair. But smiles fade, especially when sown from fear. And so the grin forger was appointed. Dressed in crimson leather and bearing no visible eyes, only a mask with a permanent sneer, the forger carried a kit of tools, fishhooks, sinew thread, heated wire, and crushed rose petals for scent. At dusk, servants and advisors were brought into the chamber. The forger worked quickly, slicing the corners of mouths, threading the cheeks upward, shaping smiles that did not require emotion. The wounds were cauterized with golden rods, and perfume was dabbed beneath the eyes to cover the scent of burning flesh. The smiles lasted months. When they faded, the grin forger returned, whistling the royal anthem. Those who refused were declared traitors and sewn shut entirely. The fourth profession was the lantern sleeper. In cities where dreams became infected, where entire households awoke screaming the same names, and where nightmares left bruises on the skin, the sleeper was the final recourse. They arrived in silence, their mouth sewn shut with horsehair, their eyes painted with thick tar. Around their neck hung a lantern filled not with oil, but with the teeth of sleepwalkers. Each night they lay in the infected house and breathed in the air of the cursed dreams. Their body twitched, their spine arched, the lantern glowed brighter with every breath. When the morning came, they were covered in scratch marks and soot. If the dreams ceased, they were paid in salt. If they persisted, the sleeper vanished, and so did the household. It was said the sleeper devoured the worst dreams, carried them deep into the caves beneath the city, and whispered them into the stones. The fifth profession was the blood smeller. In some towns, murder was more common than bread, but without evidence, justice was a game of dice. That's when the smeller arrived. Blind, cloaked in ash, they carried a wooden bell that rang with no clapper. The townsfolk followed them as they wandered the streets, sniffing the air like a hound, pausing at thresholds, kneeling near wells, humming when they smelled guilt. It was not the scent of blood itself they followed. It was the smell of blood unwept. When they began to laugh, it meant the killer was near. When they cried, the killer was already dead. In either case, they left behind a strand of hair tied to the doorknob of the guilty. If it was burned, the house crumbled within a year. The sixth and final profession in this chapter was the soot crier. In villages where children disappeared into chimneys, where hearths moaned and ashes never cooled, the villagers believed that fire itself remembered. The soot crier was summoned not to find the missing, but to mourn them in a way that kept them from returning. Dressed in gray rags and crowned with cold iron, they stood before the hearth at midnight and began to wail. Not like a mourner, but like something being burned alive. Their cries echoed through the town, causing milk to curdle and dogs to hide. As the wail reached its peak, soot poured from the fireplace, not flakes, but symbols, shapes that spelled the names of those taken. The crier caught these in their cloak and folded it 3 times. They never opened it again. Instead, they buried the cloak beneath the center of the village. If the wails continued the next year, the village was deemed cursed and abandoned. These professions, more terrifying than demons and more haunting than relics, served a world too twisted for prayers and too tired for rebellion. They were the hands that cleaned the blood history tried to forget. Now, let your eyelids fall. If your dreams feel crowded tonight, remember this: not every silence is empty. Some are just waiting to be called back into service. Sleep, and let the work of the forgotten continue without you. In the fading embers of a world consumed by plague, penance, and piety, there existed roles so grotesque, so steeped in shadowed necessity, that even the rotting chronicles of medieval scribes dared not commit their names to ink. These were the professions whispered about beneath blood-streaked chapel windows, traded like sins in confessionals, and carried down from tongue to trembling tongue as curses rather than careers. Their practitioners were not celebrated, only survived. They lived long enough to be needed again. And tonight, we begin with the bone dresser. In the farthest reaches of war-torn lands, where battlefields became cemeteries before the sun could set, the bone dresser wandered between the corpses like a needle through torn cloth. Cloaked in stitched-together armor pieces taken from the dead, they carried no weapons, only pouches filled with vinegar, wire, and soot. Their job was to reconstruct what war had scattered, but not for honor, for illusion. When noble sons fell in grotesque, unrecognizable heaps, families demanded their bodies be returned whole. The bone dresser answered those calls. With careful, practiced hands, they snapped limbs into unnatural angles, shaved jawlines into familiar shapes, inserted borrowed teeth, patched faces with pigskin and resin. They lit no candles, worked under moonlight only, and hummed a lullaby meant to fool the soul into settling. The result was always him, never questioned, always buried. And when a mother kissed the brow of a returned son, she never noticed the seam behind his ear. The second profession was the fingerminder. In cities where theft meant mutilation, and justice was etched into flesh more than memory, someone had to account for what was taken physically. Enter the fingerminder. Hunched and wrapped in bandages like a half-mummified librarian, they resided in stone vaults beneath courthouses and abbeys. Each severed digit was cataloged not by name, but by sin. A thumb meant arrogance, an index finger deceit, the middle wrath, the ring infidelity, the pinky cowardice. They arranged them on iron trays in rows, surrounded by flies and incense. When a noble returned from pilgrimage and found his coffers light, the minder would match the missing finger with the date, the town, the accused. But the job was more than filing. Each week, the minder whispered penance into the pile, feeding the sins of others into the silence of the room. If the fingers twitched, it meant a lie had gone unpunished. If they curled inward, it meant a nobleman had sinned worse than the thief. The third was the gallows composer. In villages where executions became festivals and gallows were as common as fountains, the people demanded a kind of music, something to sanctify the slaughter, to justify their cheers. The composer, always veiled in gray wool, arrived dragging a battered instrument made of stretched skin and brass piping. They tuned it using the breath of the condemned. As the noose tightened, the composer played not melodies, but moans, sighs, and trembles. Each note was a gasp stolen from lungs that still fought to live. The sound was hauntingly beautiful. Children wept. Mothers danced. Priests lowered their eyes. No two songs were ever the same, for no two deaths held the same pitch of despair. After the execution, the composer collected the final breath in a vial and gave it to the family of the deceased. It was up to them whether to drink it or bury it. The fourth profession was the bleeding curator. In castles with hidden rooms and sealed cellars, some lords collected suffering the way others collected relics. The bleeding curator was their archivist. They did not display tapestries or weaponry, but wounds. Behind locked doors, they maintained rows of glass jars, each containing the blood, flesh, or teeth of those tortured within the walls. Each specimen was labeled not with a name, but with the scream it produced. The curator could reproduce those screams with their throat, perfectly mimicked, like a bird call. When visitors royal or otherwise were granted audience with the collection, the curator gave a tour entirely through sound, guiding them by screams alone. If a scream moved the guests to tears, the lord considered it a masterpiece. The curator rarely spoke outside their performance. It was said their own tongue had been removed and replaced with a dried one soaked in vinegar and lies. The fifth was the dream barber. In towns where nightmares refused to stay behind closed eyes, where entire families suffered the same twisted visions night after night, the people believed the evil resided in the hair. Hair, they whispered, was memory that never stopped growing. The dream barber worked in total darkness, guided only by breath and tremors. Their clients sat in deep basins filled with warm ash while the barber's shears made from the bones of suicides clipped away the haunted strands. After each cut, the hair was dropped into a copper bowl. If it hissed, the nightmare had been caught. If it smoked, the client would die within a week. The barber did not warn them. At the end of the session, the bowl was poured into a grate in the floor, one that led nowhere, or everywhere. The final profession for tonight is the toll walker. In regions where the dead lingered too long and the living crossed bridges built on bone and blood, the toll walker was the only passage. Draped in robes stitched with wedding veils and funeral shrouds, they waited at the mouth of fog-choked roads. They did not speak, only held out their hand. Travelers gave them a secret, whispered directly into their palm. The walker closed their fingers around it and stepped aside. If the secret was genuine, the road stayed clear. If it was a lie, the traveler vanished before reaching the next milestone. In the morning, the walker's hand would bear a fresh scar in the shape of a letter. By nightfall, it would be gone. These were the roles that history erased not out of shame, but out of necessity. The world could not go on believing it had needed such people, but it did, and perhaps it still does. Now rest, knowing your dreams are safer, your bridges firmer, and your gallows quieter, because of those whose names we are no longer allowed to say. Sleep well. If you hear a whisper beneath your window tonight, don't answer. It might be the toll walker, still hungry for truth. In the deepest corners of medieval society, in the places where torches dimmed and prayers stuttered, where even demons kept their distance out of respect or fear, there were professions that did not dwell in the realm of trade or service, but in the maintenance of the world's most unspeakable truths. These were the final sentinels of horror, the occupations so vile, so rooted in the grotesque needs of a world built on rot and repentance, that they were passed down not by apprenticeship, but by curse. Their names have vanished. Their stories remain only in shutters and in the places where the ground won't grow. We begin this final chapter with the hollow singer. In abbeys far removed from light, in monasteries where monks dared not chant after dark, the hollow singer walked the cloisters barefoot, draped in veils soaked in wine and ash. Their voice was not used to praise, but to cleanse. In towns plagued by cursed words, oaths spoken in dying breaths, heresies uttered during convulsions, the hollow singer was summoned to undo the poison. They did not speak. They sang, but their song was not melodic. It was flat, deliberate, a single note stretched over an entire hour. During this ritual, the villagers had to plug their ears, for if they heard it for too long, their tongues would dry and crack. The song pulled the heresy from the air, curled it into invisible threads, and drew it down into the singer's chest. When they were done, they opened their mouth and expelled silence. The next morning, the town remembered nothing of the words that had once doomed them, but the singer's eyes would weep black for a week. The second profession was the echo archivist. In castles with high stone towers that hadn't been entered in centuries, where the wind carried whispers from the past, these archivists set up their listening chambers. They believed that sound never died, only diminished. With tools crafted from silver wire, deer horn, and beetle shells, they crawled through ancient ruins and positioned funnels in keyholes, behind bricks, under eaves. For weeks they sat in stillness, capturing the faint reverberations of long-forgotten screams, confessions, laughter, betrayal. Then, they transcribed what they heard using a language only they knew, etched, not on paper, but on their skin. When an archivist died, their body was flayed and added to the library walls. It was said one could hear the past whisper through their dried flesh. The third was the mourner of mirrors. In noble houses where vanity had become religion and reflection obsession, the sudden shattering of a mirror was considered not just bad luck, but an omen of invasion by something not of this world. The mourner arrived cloaked in feathers and bells, never making a sound when walking. They carried no tools, only a black sack filled with dust from previous mirrors. At sunset, they entered the shattered room and wept over the shards. Their tears did not fall, but hovered, suspended in the air, glowing faintly. When enough sorrow had collected, the shards reformed themselves not into a mirror, but into a mouth that whispered a single word. That word was recorded on parchment and burned immediately. If the smoke drifted east, the omen was lifted. If it fell to the floor, someone in the house would vanish within 3 days. The mourner never stayed to explain. The fourth was the lantern embalmer. In towns where graveyards overflowed and the dead began to move on their own accord, it became necessary to embalm more than the body. These embalmers arrived at night with lanterns that held flickering blue flames, flames taken from churches that had burned down during Mass. The bodies were prepared not with spices or oils, but with ink made from leech venom and old scripture. They traced prayers into the bones, etched runes into teeth, poured molten wax into the ears so the dead could never hear their names again. The lanterns revealed which part of the corpse still remembered life. If the flame leaned toward a finger, it was broken. If it danced near the heart, a silver nail was driven into it. When finished, the embalmer left a single coin on the forehead, not for passage, but to weigh down the soul. If the coin ever rolled off, the dead would return, and nothing could be done to stop them. The fifth profession was the breath dealer. In kingdoms choked by plague and paranoia, where air itself was feared more than sword or fire, the breath dealer became a grotesque necessity. Wearing suits made of hollow bird bones and stained parchment, they roamed the streets with jars each containing the final breath of someone important. They offered these to nobles who wished to inhale greatness, to priests who wanted to commune with saints, to executioners who sought strength. A single breath cost more than a farm, but there was risk. Some jars contained not breath, but memory, and those who inhaled them would wake screaming foreign names, reliving deaths they never died. Others simply never woke at all. The dealer never opened a jar themselves. When asked why, they pointed to their throats stitched shut permanently. The final profession, perhaps the most disturbing of all, was the memory weaver. In villages where madness spread faster than rumor, where families forgot each other overnight, where the very fabric of time seemed to fray, the weaver was summoned. Cloaked in darkness, dyed with tears, they brought with them a loom made not of wood but of human ribs, strung with strands of hair collected from those who could no longer recall their names. The weaver sat at the edge of the village and spun slowly, methodically, weaving events back into place. But memory is fickle, and the patterns were never perfect. After their work, people would remember, but not exactly. A wife would recall her husband's death as a drowning, though he'd been hanged. A child would remember their mother's lullaby in a language they never spoke, but it was enough. Enough to continue. The weaver never stayed. They burned their work and walked on, leaving behind only the smell of copper and lilac. And now, here at the edge of the abyss, with the catalog of horror complete, let us breathe the silence back in. These professions, unholy and unforgettable, were the scaffolding beneath the illusion of civility. The ones who made sure kings slept undisturbed. Villagers didn't question the impossible, and the world kept turning even as it bled. They are gone now. Or so we tell ourselves. But listen deep below your home. In the spaces between dreams and dawn, do you hear it? A breath not your own? A song that doesn't fade? A whisper shaped like your name? Sleep now, and pray that the memory weaver never forgets to leave you out of their tapestry.